Hello, everyone. Sorry for the short delay there. Had a couple technical challenges, but we got them worked out, and we're excited to be here. I'm Jared Easley. I'm one of the team members with Podcast Movement, and we're thrilled today to have Alexia Bedat. She is with Klaris Law, and today's topic is Legal Tips 101 for podcasters. Alexia, thank you so much for being willing to share your wisdom with the Podcast Movement community. We're going to go ahead and turn it over to you. If you'd be willing maybe just to tell a little bit about yourself, and then we can get your presentation up here on the screen, get going.
Amazing. Yeah. Hi, Jared. Thank you so much for having me, and to all of the community here for joining. My name is Alexia Bedat. I'm an associate at a boutique law firm based in New York called Klaris Law, and we represent all kinds of content creators. But for the purposes of today, we represent amazing content podcast creators such as yourselves, and do really everything from getting your podcast set up, helping you with the content, the agreements, distribution deals, and really taking you through the amazing content creation journey. So here's the presentation that's coming up on the screen. The goal for today is really a legal tips 101, going through a little bit in a very high level way, the basics of legal issues that you might encounter in your podcasting journey. I'm going to keep this relatively high level. So for some of you, some of these points will be very familiar. For others, they'll be new, but the goal is just to create more ground rather than very in-depth in some. And happy to take any more specific questions on any of these points or points that I haven't raised after. So if we can move to the second slide. I have to start with the usual disclosure, which is that this is for educational purposes and is not legal advice. And really, I do this for you as much as for myself. I have to do it for ethical reasons, say this, but it's really true that legal advice can change on every little single different fact. And a lot of what you take out of the presentation today also depends, are you creating a podcast independently and you are the entity that's owning the content? Are you creating the content for somebody else? And depending on the shoes you're in, what you take out can really depend what you take from this. So that's why I say it really depends on the facts, and it depends on the position you're in. For what it's worth, I'm going to more or less make the assumption for today that you're either independent podcast creators or that you are creating podcasts for yourselves, that you're not a podcast production company. It will be more or less similar if you are out there as a podcast production company listening to this, but obviously it's a little bit different because as a podcast production company, you are hiring people and you want the copyright to go to you. And if you're producing this independently, you are probably trying to make sure that you retain your rights. So with that said, for legal advice, of course, it's important to go to an attorney, but hopefully this is all helpful information. So if we move to the next slide, the reason why I thought this would be, and I'm glad that, Jared and the team agreed, would be an interesting time to have this presentation is because podcasts are really, and I don't need to tell you this, but on the map at the moment. You can see how they've been described as a Hollywood gold mine. And I have a couple of more or less recent headlines up there on the screen. And that's because podcasts have really recently grabbed the attention of Hollywood. And by Hollywood, I mean traditional Hollywood. I mean streamers and platforms like the Netflix and Hulus and Amazons of the world. And I mean also even, independent, smaller production companies. And they have become so interesting and so valuable because if you think about it, if you're producing a TV show and you're making a pilot, that is going to cost you a lot more money than producing a podcast. And if you start off with a podcast, what Hollywood has found and been attracted to is that a podcast that's successful is a really good and effective way to test the market for a story. And so rather than investing more money in a pilot, you can see Hollywood increasingly shopping around for podcasts to develop those podcasts into TV shows because the podcasts have an established following. And so I bring this up, this is important because Hollywood is only going to come knocking at your door and is only going to be interested in purchasing the rights to a podcast for a podcast where everything is in order, right? For a podcast where all the copyright issues have been taken care of, for a podcast where it's been legally and responsibly vetted and done in a proper way. They're not going to want to buy the rights to something that's a liability. So all that to say that aside from you being a responsible content creator who wants to put good content into the world and you caring about who owns your rights, if you're taking a really long-term and perhaps more macro view of this amazing content you're making, you also want to be in a position to be attractive to Hollywood should they come knocking down the one at some point down the line. And all of the things we're talking about are things that will help you put you in that position as well. So moving on to the next slide, I thought I would structure this by going a little bit through pre-production, production, and distribution, and what are some things to think about along the way. So let's start with pre-production. I put ownership of IP all the way at the top and really intentionally above the title and any trademark questions you might have. Why? In the United States, if you're thinking about when you have a trademark that's protected, in the US, it's not the first person to register that matters. In some other countries it is. In the US, it's really the first person who has been using the trademark in commerce that matters. So from the minute your podcast is out there, you're using the title, you're in business with that title, you have what's called a common law trademark protection. And that grants you some protections, not all of the protections as if you had it registered, but you already have some basic protections at that point, which is why I really intentionally put ownership first, because I think often people, the first thing they want to do is ask questions about the trademarks. And yes, it's good to do a search. It'll give you an idea of other podcasts that are out there, what's competing, how difficult or easy it's going to be for you down the line to register your trademark. But really the most important, and probably if you had to take away one thing from this whole presentation, the most important thing as a content creator is the ownership of your intellectual property. And your intellectual property in your podcast, it means your scripts, it means the recordings of the podcast itself, it means the title, it means the series as a whole. And so all of those things are very important here. And what people might not always realize is that there's two things that are important. Is one, from the minute you create something and it's fixed, so it's either recorded or written, as long as it's sufficiently original and it's really low, it's protected by copyright. So the second you record your podcast, the second you've written that script, you are sitting on a piece of protectable copyright that has a lot of benefits and a lot of things you can do with that, whether or not you go and register that copyright. There's benefits to registration, which we can get to in a minute, but really ownership of your IP there is really important. And if you're working by yourself and you're the only owner, you're the only creator, you are the owner of that IP, right? The author is the owner of the IP. But let's say you have a co-host. Let's say you are producing the podcast with someone. Let's say a friend of yours designed amazing work for your cover art. Let's say another friend of yours who's a good composer composed for you your theme song or the music throughout the podcast. Unless you have agreements with these people, the default position is they own their contributions to that content. They own the song, they own the artwork, they own part of your podcast if they've written the scripts or edited or things in that line of work. So what's important is to have agreements with these people, to have, even if it's an agreement by a short written agreement, it doesn't have to be complicated, but that's very important so that you are the sole owner of the IP in your podcast. And the magic words you're looking for in these agreements are the three magic words, which are work for hire. Now, work for hire are the magic legal words, which essentially mean if somebody signs a work for hire agreement for you, it means that the work they create, you are treated as the owner of that IP as soon as it's created. So one thing to think about if you're creating content with other people is have something in writing with them that makes clear that you hold the IP. Going back to Hollywood, think, down the line, if one day you want to sell your podcast, You don't want somebody that you worked with at the beginning to then raise their hand and say, 1 second, you can't do that because I actually own half of this podcast with you. Or it's someone that you really are working with, for example, a partner of yours or, a co-host, in which case have that in writing and clarify your relationship with them and how you both own the IP, who gets to make decisions, how the revenue is split. All of those things being set out in writing will really take you a long way. And so if you're thinking about the kinds of people that it's helpful to have an agreement with, it might be your co-host, it might be any producers you've hired, it might be editors. Are you using a production company that renders services in audio production? Is anybody designing the cover art for you? Is anybody composing music for you? Those are typically the kind of individuals that you'd want to have written agreements with. The other thing when we speak about ownership that's really important is your RSS feed, right? Your RSS feed is a direct line of communication from you to your audience. It's a way of developing a base, an audience base. It's a way of developing a relationship. If you then make a new podcast, you can drop that new podcast into that feed and leverage your existing audience. And it's a very important thing to think about if ever you're entering into a distribution deal or selling the rights to your podcast. If you are able to, you won't always be able to, depending on the nature of the deal, but to the extent you can, retaining ownership of your RSS feed, or at the very least, promotional rights to your RSS feed. So the ability to drop, 4, 5, whatever number you negotiate, promotional drops into the feed over the course of the year, even if you've given control over to it. Those are all important things to think about. Now, moving slightly away from ownership and towards agreements. So I spoke about the agreements with people who create content. What about releases, which we hear about a lot? And the two types of releases that come up are location releases and appearance releases. Location releases probably don't apply as much in the podcast space because you're probably recording out of a studio. But to the extent that you're doing a walk and talk, to the extent that you ever do need to go record in a location, you may be required to sign a location release. And if you are, you want to make sure in any location release you sign that you're not handing over any rights in terms of how you can use the recording you're doing at the release. So I would always read those very carefully because you could have sneaky language in there that actually affects your ability to use the recording that you made at the location. The other big one is appearance releases. And this is a question we get asked all the time is, do my guests need to sign appearance releases? Different people will give you different opinions on this. The basic starting point is that there's no legal requirement to get and release from your guests as long as your guest understands and it's clear that they were appearing on a podcast. And by appearing and speaking on the mic, they're effectively consenting to being on your podcast, and you can then release that recording. Now, where it gets tricky is, well, what else is implied in that implied license, right? If you just told them, hey, I'd like to record you for my podcast, and you record them, are they then consenting to you using a clip in promotion on social media? Question mark. Are they then consenting to you using a clip in a trailer? Same. If you wanted to then use a clip they recorded in another podcast of yours, probably not, right? So the extent of the implied release by just being recorded is not always clear, which is why having an appearance release makes much clearer what you can and can't do, right? You could have your guests agree to making 1, 2, 3 social media posts the month that you release the episode. You can ask certain things of them and have that agreement in writing, which you wouldn't otherwise. You can ask them to keep confidential their appearance until you release your episode. So anything that goes above and beyond the basic implied consent of appearing on your podcast, that's where the benefit of having an agreement with your guests kick in. Now, approvals. This ties to really if you're working with someone else or a co-host, anyone that you are creating the content with, how are you handling the approvals? Who gets to make decisions about what goes into the content? Who has final say? Other very important approvals are the approvals that relate to business decisions. Who gets to say how it's distributed? Who gets to say if you can exclusively make a deal to distribute your podcast on a given platform? Let's say going back to Hollywood, right? Hollywood's interested, you want to sell a TV show, you have a co-host. Do you both need to make that decision? Does somebody have tie break, or is one of you the more business-minded person and do you agree from the get-go that you're going to be in charge of business decisions? Those are all things which it might sound a little bit dry, but you can put those things in a contract and save yourself the headache of having to figure out down the line how you draw that line. The other thing is, to the extent you're entering into any agreement with anyone who's creating content for you or with you, make sure you're getting very broad distribution rights. You don't want any limitations in your agreement on how you can distribute your podcast. So that's something to take a close look at to the extent you are entering into deals with anyone. Renewal is also important, right? At podcasts, we're very much talking about episodic and serial format, where hopefully season 1 goes really well and you want to do season 2. Ideally, when you've done an agreement for season 1, you've included language in there about the ability to renew for season 2, either on the same terms or with a preset increase in the fees. And why do you want to do that? Well, if season 1 goes really well and you want to do season 2 with a colleague or somebody else who's working on the show, if it's done really well, they're going to have more leverage after season 1 to negotiate a better deal because they know you need them to make season 2. So having your renewals set from the get-go removes that new negotiation and also makes it, an easier decision for you whether you can make another season and how to go about it. And the other thing I would flag for agreements is also derivative rights. So a derivative work is really the legal jargon for a work that's based on something else. So a derivative work of your podcast is a new work based on your podcast. So a TV show based on your podcast would be a derivative work of your podcast. And so if ever you're signing a deal or there's a limitation on the ability to make derivative works or your derivative rights, that's something to pay attention to, because it means there's some kind of limitation on your ability to make new works based on your podcast. So hopefully those are a couple of helpful pointers for things to think about in pre-production before you get started with making your podcast. I will just say there before we move to the next slide, I had mentioned that copyright registration. So if you remember what I said before, from the minute you create IP in a fixed form, so written, recorded, you have copyright protection. The benefit of registering your copyright, whether it's your scripts or the podcast recordings themselves, is that when you are a couple, there's one, if there's ever a dispute about who owns the IP, that's a very good proof of ownership that you have a registration. Another is that if you want to be able one day to sue someone, you need a registration to file your lawsuit in court. And when you have a registered copyright, you're allowed by law to ask for certain damages if somebody infringes your copyright. You don't have to prove your damages. You have what are called statutory damages. So a number of advantages to registering your IP. It's a relatively simple process. If you go on the Copyright Office's website, there are very helpful PDFs that talk you through all of the steps to registering your copyright. And so that's something that you can, of course, ask an attorney if you have questions. But even, anybody who's computer savvy or just good at following instructions really should be able to do it. So it's, might sometimes seem an inaccessible thing, but it's actually relatively simple. So with that said, we can move to production questions. Thanks, Jared. So during production, what are some things to think about? You want to think about certain best practices as though you were creating any other kind of content, right? If you were a journalist working at a newspaper, there would be best practices around your collection of information. And a podcast really functions the same way. So you want to think about when you're recording, for example, right? If you're doing any kind of investigative narrative work and you're interviewing different sources, you want to keep notes of your recordings that you can go back to. Interviewing more than one source on a specific contentious point is important. If you're interviewing somebody who, sort of gives you a different angle to follow or cast doubt on the version they're saying, follow those other avenues, those other paths. The more information you have, the better. And you also want to think about the kinds of agreements you're making. You may be working on a sensitive topic that a source will only speak to you about on condition of anonymity. And be very careful in what you agree when you're talking about that, right? Because if you say, I won't name you on my podcast, that's very different than I won't identify you on my podcast, because name just means I won't say your name, but identify is a bigger obligation on you because it means you can't include any details that are potentially identifying about them to the people they know. So be deliberate with the agreements you make and your choice of words in those agreements with your sources. You want to report your story enough that you are confident about its accuracy and reliability. There are all kinds of standards that apply in law when we're talking about whether you've defamed someone. And without going into them specifically, you really want to be able to tell someone down the line if they challenge you, it turns out I got it wrong, but at the time, I truly believe that this was accurate, right? Like I went to different sources to the extent that any source cast doubt on something, I explored that option too. You don't have a duty to explore and interview every possible person, but you should just be able in good faith to be confident about the accuracy and reliability of the information that you are putting out there. So you might want to ask your source, is there somebody else I could speak to who could corroborate your version of events? And so all of this, of course, really applies more for those of you out there who are doing any kind of investigative, more narrative podcasting. But as a rule of thumb, just good practices with your sources are important. And the other big one is vetting your podcast. And what I mean by that is having an attorney review your podcast before it gets published. And this is going to be important if your podcast contains potentially sensitive information. Are you writing about identifiable people? Are you maybe defaming someone? Are you revealing what would be considered private information on your podcast? Those are all things that an attorney can help you go through and make sure that you're not going to get in trouble for your podcast, or if you do, that you're going to be able to make it go away quickly because you've got good defenses to whatever claim somebody might raise. And as part of vetting and reviewing your podcast before it's released, one question in that exercise is also the materials, right, that are not created by you that you include in your podcast. And so have you included music from a third party? Have you included an interview that was carried out by a third party? Are you reading out a poem, right? It's not because you are reading another piece of IP out loud yourself that it doesn't mean that that underlying IP that you're reading out isn't protected. So to the extent that any third-party material is included in your podcast, you want to make sure you've either licensed that material or you're relying on fair use. And now let's take each of those in turn. If you've licensed your materials, what you need really is just an agreement that gives you the right to use the materials in your podcast and promotion of your podcast. That's the basic minimum you'd want. Ideally, you'd also have the right to use that material in derivatives of the podcast. Let's say you want to combine your podcast into an audiobook. You don't want to go back to each person that you license content from and get a new license. You'd ideally want that word derivatives to be in your original license so that your license covers whatever other works based on your podcast you then create. And licenses can be really simple, right? If you're getting non-exclusive rights, so you don't care that the interview is going to be somewhere else, the third-party material you're using, you just want the right to use it non-exclusively, then even a written agreement by email is enough. Where you need an actual signed agreement in writing is if you're getting exclusive rights, or if you're getting all of the rights forever, and nobody else can use that content, then you want something in writing. But most of the time, you'll be able to just get away with an email and keep a record of all of those licenses so you can point to them down the line if ever you need to. Now, fair use. That's the big question. What does fair use actually mean? So fair use is a concept in the law where essentially the law allows you to use somebody else's content without paying for it, because the law and as a society, we deem that it's a fair use of that material. And fair use, there are 4 factors that are set out in the Copyright Act that say what a fair use is. But what it really comes down to is whether your use is transformative. Are you using someone else's content in a way that's different, that gives it a new meaning, that your audience is going to understand and process it and take something away from it different than if they were listening to it in its original source from the original author? For example, let's say you're covering how the media in the United States today and the differences in perspectives from different news and media outlets. And you took one story and you take snippets from how different news outlets covered the story. You take a short clip from CNN, from ABC, from Fox, from Sky News, and you play those clips in your podcast to comment on the different ways and angles that this story was covered depending on the news outlet. That's a good example of a fair use, because people listening to the news clips in your podcast are listening to it to understand your comment about different media commentary on the same topic. People listening to those news reports originally when they came out were listening to them to actually get the news. And so that's one example of a fair use and how your use would be transformative based on the original. If your podcast is a comment, or you're making critiques or reviews of films, and you are talking about an actor's technique and the way that he, very clearly enunciates in a specific scene of the film, one of his monologues, and you play a very short clip of that and you're commenting on that, again, it depends on your exact use, but that's a good example, a good candidate for fair use. And you always want to remember to use just what you need to make your point, right? If at any point in time you feel like you could cut the clip shorter, cut it shorter, because that's an important factor, is how much of it you're using, and that you're using no more than necessary to make your point. So, for example, when I'm reviewing a podcast, I'll always listen very closely when a client wants to fair use something as to whether it's running under the narration, because that's going to be a really difficult thing to justify. If after you hear the clip, it continues under the narration for a long time, there's no real reason for that, unless you're specifically speaking as the podcast is going to the clip that you can hear under it. There's really no good reason for that. So again, just to summarize that for fair use, you want your use to be transformative, so give a new meaning to the material. You want to use no more than necessary of the material, and be very careful if you're using things as background and underlying audio. Which the final point I wanted to bring up here is, of course, music, right? So ideally, fair use is going to be very difficult to argue a fair use of your intro or theme or just music that you're using as background. It's going to be virtually impossible to argue fair use there. So that content, you either want to license it, you want to maybe use stock music. Be careful if you're using stock music, read the fine print, because different stock houses will have different terms and conditions about what you can and can't do with the music there. So make sure it covers all the things you want to be able to do in your podcast. Or you could, hire a friend to write something for you. If it's a friend, again, I would have a very simple agreement with them that makes sure it's a work for hire, or gives you a perpetual exclusive or non-exclusive if you're okay with the music being elsewhere. But those are things that you want to think about. Same with the sound effects, any jingles, anything that you put in your podcast that you haven't yourself created. Make sure that you have a good legal basis for including it in your content. So we did pre-production, production, and now we'll move to distribution. So distribution, there are many ways to distribute podcasts. The main ones that you may be thinking about or hearing about right now, you've got advertising, sponsorship, and membership. So advertising, that tends to be once your podcast has hit a certain amount of downloads and listens, people tend to say that in order to be attractive to advertisers, we're talking about 10,000 downloads per month per average per episode. But again, maybe you have an advertiser who's looking for a very niche audience and you've got a smaller amount of downloads, but it's in the demographic that they're looking for. So you could be attractive to them even with a smaller podcast. If you are going down the advertising road and you're entering into any kind of deal for advertising, some things to think about. How much advertising are you putting in each episode? Is that clearly set out in your deal? Do you have any kind of say over the kind of advertising that's going into the podcast? If you're working with a host also, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, making sure that your host agrees to do ad reads could be beneficial. There have been recently some studies that say that advertising is more successful when it's read by the host than an advertisement. So you might have advertisers that are going to be more attracted to your podcast if the host reads it. Depends on who you're approaching. Sponsorship. That might be a more attractive proposition if you're still setting up your podcast and not quite at the level yet to attract advertising, where a specific episode could be sponsored by a brand. What's very important whenever you're doing any kind of sponsorship deal is to very clearly disclose this to your audience, right? If you have, the local bakery, for example, that's sponsoring this episode, you want to tell them at the beginning and have a clear disclosure that says, today we're really excited to bring this podcast in collaboration with, the bakery around the corner. And you disclose it, right? Because there's a very clear rules in the US to protect consumers from any kind of deception or false advertising. And they need to know that there is this commercial relationship with another entity before the show starts when they're listening to it. So those disclosures are important to think about. And if you're entering into a deal for sponsorship, think really clearly and look at what's being negotiated. If it just says that we agree to sponsor the podcast, what does that mean? Does that mean each episode? Does that mean the first episode? Anytime you're entering into a deal, the more details, the better, because you might run the first episode with sponsorship and then none, and they come knocking at your door and say, I don't understand. We said we were sponsoring the podcast. Well, what did that mean? So clarity is definitely your friend when it comes to these kind of deals. And the other option are memberships. So, the Patreons of the world out there, it can be a great option for your podcast. Also, if you've got other, perks to offer, such as merch to people who have membership, that's worked really nicely from some clients of ours. And one thing to think about is definitely, again, read the fine print, right? If you're putting your podcast up on a platform which offers membership, read the terms and conditions. What rights are you giving the platform? It will all be set out there. It might be hard to find, but there will be terms and conditions about what you're agreeing to before putting your podcast up there. And that's something to consider. And in terms of making your decisions of how to distribute your podcast, different stages in your podcast creation life, you will have different interests that you want to serve. You might be at a point in your career where you really need help promoting your podcast. So you might have a distribution deal where their promotional offerings are really strong, or you might still need a lot of help at this point with producing the podcast, and you might have a distributor that offers strong production support. So think about really, it's a give and take. Like, what benefits are you getting from this distribution agreement as well? If you have a podcast whose trajectory you admire, maybe ask them, right? Like, how did you get to where you are today? It's a pretty collegiate, friendly community. And I would imagine that most podcasters are happy to share and some tips about how they got there. So, rely on this really great and helpful community. And now just the last slide, some things to think about whenever you're making distribution deals. You want to think about a couple of things. So, and I don't know if you guys can see the last slide. It's up on the screen yet. Amazing. Thanks, Jared. So again, like I said before, whenever you're making any kind of deal that has to do with distributing your podcast, details, right? Read the fine print, read what you're agreeing to, or if you don't like reading terms and conditions, at the very least, ask a friend to read it if you're not asking a lawyer, but know what deal you're making. And you always want, as the podcast owner, for the rights to be as narrow as possible. What kind of rights are you giving them? There's always a section about the license and that says what the terms of the license are. Read that carefully to make sure that you know what you're handing over. Exclusivity is another thing to look for, right? Are you telling a distributor that they're going to have the exclusive right to distribute it or not? In law, the default position is a license is not exclusive unless it says it is. So look to see if there's any words around exclusivity. Credit, right? You want to make sure that if somebody else is distributing your podcast for you, that your credit, that your name is always there whenever the podcast is distributed. And you also want to see what kind of obligations the distributor has other than credit. So that I kind of mentioned it on the last slide, but what do they have to do? Do they have promotion obligations? Do they have any kind of production support obligations? What happens? You see term is the last one there. What happens at the end of their distribution term? Do they have to remove your podcast from the platform? Do they get to leave it up? Make sure there is a term to what you're signing, unless you're happy to sign over your podcast with distribution rights indefinitely, you'll want some clarity there on how long the distribution term is. And so with that, I have my contacts that are up on the last slide. Feel free to get in touch. And I guess we have a little bit of time if there are any questions. And thank you all. And I hope you found that informative and helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Wow, that was great. So, I mean, you've kind of touched on this in the session, but let's just kind of go back for a little bit. What are one or two major things that a new podcaster needs to consider starting out?
Sure. A new podcaster starting out, I really would say one of the main things is making sure that you have some form of written agreements with the people you're working with. It might seem often, especially if you're starting out, you're probably leveraging, amazing, talented people that you're friends with. Somebody's a composer and they can write the theme for your podcast, or you have a friend who's a great artist, or somebody's really good at writing or audio production. Whoever you're working with, I would say an important thing is to have some kind of written agreement with them that sets out clearly your relationship, that you own the IP if that's what you want, any kind of payment terms, just anything you can get in paperwork that clarifies your relationship from the get-go will almost always save you a lot of headache in the long run. So that would definitely be one of them. Another one would be to just think of and be responsible with the content you're creating. If you're doing a show that's giving or discussing health and wellness, like disclosures that this is, just educational, that this isn't advice, that if you need medical advice, go see a doctor. If you're doing some kind of more investigative podcast, think about best practices and how you're reporting that, keeping notes, anything that goes towards creating your content responsibly is a good thing to always have at the back of your mind.
All right, so we have a few questions here. Here's one from Federica. She says, podcasts are normally distributed all around the world. What law applies of each country? Thank you.
That's a great question, Federica. So the position a lot of people will take is, if you're creating your podcast in the US, is that you're going to have the laws that applies to your podcast or in your agreements be US law, right? You can't produce your podcast with the defamation laws of every single country in the world in mind. So it'll really depend. When you say what law applies, it depends, right? What law applies between you and a distributor or between you and a host could depend on the kind of agreement you have and whether there's what you call a governing law clause, which says what's the law that's going to govern. If you're asking, could I get sued for something somewhere else in the world? Yes, it depends on the individual, right? If you say something about somebody who's a UK, lives in London and they have a reputation in the UK, then they would have standing to bring the lawsuit in the UK. So it really depends. But I would say, you can proceed on the understanding of US law and, make US law at least the governing law of your agreements. And if you're ever doing a specific episode, either about an individual or with an individual who is based abroad, then have an agreement with them that makes the US the governing law of your relationship. And that'll at least be one thing towards making that clear.
Okay, we have some more questions here. This is from Jay. Can I use a 200-year-old painting as my art without paying for a license? It's from an Austrian museum.
Yeah, that's a great question. So really, Jay, what you're speaking about there is what we call public domain. So at least in the US, what year are we in now? I think we're looking at 1925, right? So anything that was created before 1925 is in the public domain and you can use. So that means, for example, yes, to your question, a 200-year-old painting could be used without a license. But I want to say two important caveats to that is one, the painting itself but make sure you're not using a picture of the painting or something more recent that is protected, right? Because while the image itself is protected, if someone can prove that you're using their image of something that's protected, you could potentially get in trouble there. So just go get possibly your old image, either that you took or from a stock place. So just be careful with the actual file that you're using. And the other thing to bear in mind is, the 1925 rule also applies to music, right? So if you wanted to use Beethoven or Mozart or, a very old piece of classical music in your podcast, you could, but you have to make the distinction between the composition itself, which is in the public domain because it was written before 1925, and the recording, right? If you use a recording of a Philharmonic from last year, that recording is protected by copyright, and you would not be able to use that without a license, or if you're relying and have gotten good advice that it's a fair use. So when you're using really old music, often I say one of the tricks is get somebody who can play it on an instrument, get them to play it, make sure you have an agreement with them so you can use their recording, but at least there you don't have a problem with the underlying composition. So all that to say that even with public domain, you still want to think about, is the underlying material and the embodiment of it, are they both in the public domain?
Oh, that's really helpful. All right. So Michael has a question. How careful do we or our guests have to be with our words when sharing our opinions on organizations and people, what they did, what they're doing? What are some examples of defamation?
Also a great question. So luckily, Michael, you're in the United States, or I'm assuming you're in the United States, which has a very strong First Amendment and very strong free speech protections. And in the US, in order to claim that a statement is defamatory, it has to be a statement of fact that can be proved as true or false. So if I say Shannon robbed a bank yesterday, that's either true or false. Shannon either did rob a bank or did not rob a bank. And that's an example of a potentially defamatory statement, because defamatory, it's a statement essentially that lowers the reputation of a person among, the majority of society. And so saying that you robbed a bank, most people would think less of Shannon. And if that's not true, that's a defamatory statement. An opinion, on the other hand, you can't prove as true or false. So if you say, Shannon was completely unprepared to deal with this new situation at work, how can you prove whether Shannon was completely unprepared or not? That's an opinion. It's not capable of being proven true or false. And so that's protected speech, and Shannon would not be able to bring a claim for that. Now, one thing to remember is just saying, I think that, or in my opinion, X, before what's a statement of fact, does not make it an opinion. So if you say, in my opinion, Shannon robbed the bank yesterday, it doesn't transform that into an opinion. So it really, the core of the statement you're making, that's what you're looking at. And if it's capable of being proven true or false, then it's a fact which you want to get correct, and versus an opinion, which is really something different. So hopefully that helps the line a little bit, but you're really, to the extent you're sharing opinions and criticisms about organizations and their policies, you have a pretty large range to do that. As soon as you're starting to share facts, if you say this organization has only hired white men for the past 5 years, that's a fact. And so that's something that you'd want to do your due diligence to make sure you are getting correct. And what's correct and how far you have to go to show that you've done your due diligence, that really depends on whether you're speaking about a private individual, a public individual, or an organization. And there are different standards that apply. And I won't go into them really too much in detail, but largely, you have to be able to stand by what you say and prove and show, even if you don't include in your podcast, here are all the things that I did. There's no obligation on you to disclose it. There's just an obligation on you to have done, not been negligent if you're talking about a public figure or a company, and not having been negligent if it's a private figure. And if you're talking about a public figure, it's a bit of a higher standard. You have to truly subjectively believe it's true or not be reckless about the truth. So crash course a little bit in defamation, but hopefully that's helpful.
Oh, that's definitely helpful. We have one more question here. This is from Tarina. I'm an independent solo podcaster. Do I have to worry about losing my intellectual property? I'm confused.
Yeah. Well, let me see if I can hopefully unconfuse you a bit. So no, right? You, Tarina, from the minute you create something as a solo podcaster, you're the only person who owns that IP, right? You own your podcast, you're recording it. The only time you have to worry about losing your IP is either if you're ever making a deal with someone about your IP, where there's any language in the agreement about you giving somebody else's rights or selling any rights, or if you're working with someone on your podcast. So it doesn't sound like it now because you're saying you're a solo podcaster, but let's say you brought on a co-host, right, to work with you because your podcast is successful and you want help. It's not that you would lose your IP, it's that somebody else would also be able to claim their share to your IP. So when you're working with someone, it's not that you're handing over your IP to them unless you agree in writing to that. It's just that there's now another person in the ring who can claim ownership to your IP, like a co-owner, basically.
All righty. I think that concludes our Q&A portion. We have added your email address, Alexia, so that people can reach out to you and contact you, and hopeful that they'll do that. Is there any place else that you want to recommend where people can go if they want to be in touch?
My LinkedIn, our website has some resources. If you're podcasters and just have questions about content generally, defamation, like some of the questions, there are really good resources online. The reporters community is really good. Podcast University. But yeah, a lot of resources available online as well.
Wonderful. Alexia, we appreciate your time and your vast knowledge in this area. Thank you for sharing with the community, and we wish you the absolute best. And we hope people will reach out to you again at your email, which is in the chat, or they can reach out to you on LinkedIn. So thank you again for your time.
Thanks for having me, and have a lovely Memorial Day weekend, everyone.
Likewise, and thank you for everyone joining us today. We appreciate it.
Bye.